Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Medisodes. We'll be looking at the different pandemics that have happened throughout history. First, we'll be taking a look at the Black Death, which happened in 1350. First cholera pandemic happened in 1817. Spanish flu, which happened in 1918, followed by SARS, which occurred in 2003. But first, let us start off with the Black Death. Straight.
The Black Death is one of the most important pandemics in human history and affects, probably at least in the old world of Europe and Asia, one of the most deadly. So, the Black Death is a popular name given to a devastating global epidemic of the bubonic plague, and it was thought to have hit Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s. Its arrival in Europe is thought to be in October 1347. From 12 ships that came from the Black Sea and docked in the Sicilian port of Messina. Most of the sailors were found dead, and the survivors were ill and covered in black boils that oozed with blood and pus. So at the time, the Black Death was known as the Great Pestilence. The actual plague is thought to have started in Asia almost 2,000 years ago. The bacteria that caused it is called Yersinia pestis, and even today that's the main plague bacteria. This bacteria was only discovered at the end of the 19th century by Alexandre Yersin, hence the name. The scale of this pandemic is truly staggering. So at this time they didn't have very good infection control at all. In 5 years the plague killed 20 million Europeans. That's about a third of the population from before the pandemic. That population didn't recover until the 16th century. And in England, it was pretty bad as well. In 1400, the population was half what it had been in 1300. There was depopulation or disappearance of 1,000 villages in England. They just vanished because everyone had died from the plague. When we look at the main way it spread, it's thought that firstly, it was spread by trading ships coming from the east. So it started in Asia, and it kind of moved its way towards Europe through trading ships. Fleas infected with the Yersinia pestis bacterium, the bite of the flea caused the Black Death to be spread, and also the rats would. So at this time, obviously, there was not much public health measures at all in place, and they didn't really understand how it spread. It was only much later that this is just a hypothesis, but it's probably the best guess of what caused it to spread. And the scary thing about it was the fact that healthy people could go to sleep and then be dead in the morning because of the Black Death Act. It was highly, highly deadly. And because they didn't understand the cause at this time, because most people were religious, they believed it was a punishment by God for bad deeds. This led to many things in terms of going to church or people trying to atone for their sins. But there was also anti-Semitism. As with a lot of things in the medieval period, Jewish people were unfairly blamed for most things that went wrong, and this was no different. And many Jewish people fled east because they were basically targeted in pogroms. And a root of anti-Semitism was expressed throughout, and many Jewish people were killed because of it. So in terms of symptoms, we're looking at, obviously, the bubonic plague causes buboes, which are basically swellings, and they mainly happened in the groin and the armpits, and they could be up to the size of an apple, and they seeped out blood and pus. This is because the bacteria attacks the lymphatic system, and that causes the swelling of the lymph nodes. And then the actual thing that kills you, the fact that then that will spread to the blood and the lungs, and that will eventually lead to death. But before that, you have fevers, chills, vomiting, and diarrhea. So it's definitely not a nice infection to get at all, at any time, but especially not in the medieval period where they didn't actually know how to treat it. The methods they had to treat it were crude bloodletting and boil lancing, which both were not very effective and very painful, as well as your general using herbs and stuff like that. And also, actually, another side effect that made it worse was many doctors refused to see patients. Many priests refused to do last rites. Shops were closed. Many people were fleeing from the city to the countryside. And that meant that the people who did have the infection were kind of left Even people's loved ones would abandon them to save themselves. The problem with the plague was that actually livestock was very affected by this disease as well, and a lot of livestock died as well, which is very bad for farmers and very bad for general food production. And also, there were so many sheep were killed in this kind of mass exodus from the city that there was actually a wool shortage in Europe for many years. How did it end? The thing with the Black Death is the bubonic plague never really went away. There's still a couple thousand cases of it scattered around the globe. However, it's obviously much better contained. We have antibiotics and other modern medical interventions. The Black Death actually gave us a very important public health measure, and it was the first pandemic where public health was advanced in a way, and something we use today, especially in 2021. So in order to curb the spread of the Black Plague, officials in the port city of Ragusa decided that sailors who wanted to enter the port had to isolate initially, and with this they basically created social distancing. So initially that was 30 days they had to stay on the ship, which is known as Trestino, but later this was increased to 40 days, and that was called quarantine. And that's where we get the word quarantine from. It's the fact that sailors had to isolate on these boats for 40 days. Although, of course, quarantine now is used for any number of days. The Black Death was one of the most deadly plagues in the whole of European history and global history. Obviously not the last one. Now on to Surya, who's going to be talking about the 1817 cholera pandemic.
Cholera has been around for many centuries. The disease came to prominence in the 19th century. A lethal outbreak occurred in India. There have since been numerous outbreaks and 7 global pandemics of cholera. Each year, cholera infects 1.3 to 4 million people around the world, killing 21,000 to 143,000 people, according to the World Health Organization. Cholera is an infectious disease caused by a bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. The bacteria typically lives in waters that are somewhat salty and warm, such as estuaries and waters along coastal areas. The first cholera pandemic emerged out of the Ganges Delta with an outbreak in Jessore, India in 1817, stemming from contaminated rice. The disease quickly spread through most of India, modern-day Myanmar, and modern-day Sri Lanka by travelling along trade routes established by Europeans. By 1820, cholera has spread through Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, killing 100,000 people on the island of Java alone. From Thailand and Indonesia, the disease made its way to China in 1820 and Japan in 1822 by way of infected people on ships. It also spread beyond Asia. In 1821, British troops travelling from India to Oman brought cholera to the Persian Gulf. The disease eventually made its way to European territory, reaching modern-day Turkey, Syria, and southern Russia. The pandemic died out 6 years after it began, likely thanks to the severe winter in 1823-24, which may have killed the bacteria living in water supplies. Hopefully that has given you good insight into the first cholera pandemic. And now on to Adrian for a brief history of the Spanish flu.
Spanish flu, also known as the Great Influenza Epidemic or the 1918 influenza pandemic, was an exceptionally deadly global influenza pandemic caused by the H1N1 influenza A virus. There is no universal consensus regarding where the virus first originated, though the first cases were identified in the USA. It is estimated that nearly 500 million people became infected by the virus in 4 successive waves, which is only 1/3 of the world population at the time. Estimations of deaths range from 17 million to 50 million, but could be as high as 100 million, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The earliest documented case was in March 1918 in the USA, with further cases recorded in France, Germany, and the UK in April. The term Spanish flu is an unsuitable name for this pandemic. The pandemic broke out near the end of the First World War, at a time where most newspapers censored bad news in order to maintain a positive morale. However, the press in Spain freely reported the outbreak, creating the false impression that Spain was the epicenter of the outbreak. Most influenza epidemics disproportionately affected the young and the old, but this pandemic had an unusually high mortality for young adults. The virus was particularly deadly because it triggered a cytokine storm, ravaging the stronger immune system of younger adults, although the viral infection seemed no more aggressive than previous outbreaks. Malnourishment, overcrowded hospitals, and poor hygiene was exacerbated by the war, and promoted bacterial superinfection, killing most victims after a prolonged deathbed. Though the origin cannot be said for certain, the pandemic is usually marked as having begun on 4th of March 1918 in the USA, in the state of Kansas. As the US entered the First World War, the disease quickly spread from the US to Europe. It reached North Africa, India, and Japan in May, and an outbreak was reported in China in June. After reaching Australia in July, the first wave of this pandemic started to recede. During this first wave, mortality rates were not much above normal, with 75,000 flu-related deaths in the USA, relative to the 63,000 flu-related deaths at a normal time before the pandemic. The second wave began in the second half of August 1918, and this wave was much more deadly than the first. The first wave was similar to a typical flu epidemic, with those greatest at risk being the sick and elderly, whilst the second wave targeted young adults. The third wave was in 1919, and first affected Australia, killing approximately 12,000 people following the lifting of a maritime quarantine, before spreading through Europe and the US, lingering through the spring and until June 1919. The fourth wave was in 1920, occurring in isolated areas such as New York City, Switzerland, and some South American islands. By the end of 1920, the virus that caused the pandemic became much less deadly and caused only ordinary seasonal flu. The basic reproduction number of the virus was between 2 and 3. Which means that, on average, each person that caught the virus went on to infect 2 and 3 people. The close quarters and massive troop movements of the First World War hastened the rate of the pandemic, leading to increased transmission and augmented mutation. Some speculate that the soldiers' immune systems were weakened by malnourishment, as well as the stresses of combat and chemical attacks, which increased their susceptibility to being infected by the virus. In civilian life, natural selection favours milder strains of the virus. People with more severe strains stay at home, whilst people with milder strains continue to go out and spread this strain to others. However, during the war this was reversed. Soldiers infected by mild strains stayed to carry on fighting, whilst soldiers with more severe strains were sent on crowded trains to crowded hospitals where this strain could be spread. The majority of those infected experienced only the typical flu symptoms of the sore throat, headache, and fever, especially during the first wave. However, during the second wave, the disease was much more serious, more complicated by bacterial pneumonia, which was the usual cause of death. This pneumonia was itself caused by a common upper respiratory tract bacteria, which are able to get into the lungs via the damaged bronchial tubes of the victims. The virus also killed people directly by causing massive hemorrhages and edema in the lungs. So that's a brief summary of the Spanish flu, how it spread, its various waves, and why it was different to other pandemics. Now I hand over to Anupam, who will be discussing the 2003 SARS pandemic.
So, now about the SARS outbreak. During the 21st century, the current SARS-CoV-2 strain, which has caused the COVID-19 pandemic, was not the first coronavirus species to cause a health crisis. MERS, or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, also had outbreaks in 2015, 2012, and 2018, which affected countries in the Middle East, but also had cases in South Korea and the United States reported. Together, these outbreaks had roughly 2,500 cases as of March 2021. However, in 2002 to 2004, SARS, or Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, had its first major outbreak caused by the spread of SARS-CoV-1, a closely related strain of the current coronavirus. Till 2019, this was the largest coronavirus outbreak of history, with 8,096 confirmed cases and 774 deaths. The 2002 SARS outbreak primarily affected the Asia-Pacific region, with the vast majority of cases from China, with 5,327 reported cases, Hong Kong, with 1,755 cases, Taiwan, with 346, Canada, with 251 reported cases, and finally Singapore, with 238. In total, the outbreak reached 30 territories. However, the majority were isolated pockets, with only 8 countries reporting cases in the double digits or above. Similarly to the current pandemic, the first case of infection was traced to China, in Foshan in the Guangdong province on the 16th of November 2002. The PRC only notified the WHO on the 10th of February 2003, by which time 305 cases were reported across China. The first superspreader event occurred just before the 31st of January, where 30 nurses and doctors were infected. Across February, the diseases spread to Hong Kong, Vietnam, and Canada, with the superspreader event for all these outbreaks being tracked to an event at the Metropole Hotel in Hong Kong. From there, hotel guests travelled back to their home countries, leading to further spreading. Of note was Chinese-American Johnny Chen, who, after rooming in the Metropole Hotel, was admitted to the French hospital of Hanoi on the 26th of Feb, infecting at least 38 staff. Of these was WHO infectious disease specialist Carlo Urbani, who is credited as the first to identify SARS as a new, dangerous and viral disease. Sadly, he contracted the illness himself and died shortly after. By March of 2003, cases were also identified in Taiwan, Singapore and Hong Kong, leading to the CDC in America and the WHO announcing global alerts and travel advisory on the regions in Asia affected. Local governments also announced local restrictions, such as the compulsory quarantine of infected persons by the Singapore government from the 25th of March, or the cancellation of all classes in educational institutions in Hong Kong around the same time. By April, the US government had recalled all non-essential consular personnel from Hong Kong and Guangzhou, as well as advising its citizens to not travel to the region. Countries around the world became increasingly aware of the spread of the disease across the Asia-Pacific region, leading to other countries following suit and either recalling personnel or issuing travel bans. School closures across the region were extended, and following cases in America and further abroad, the People's Republic of China became more open about their information regarding the disease spread, after initially attempting to mask the spread of the disease within China. On the 11th of April, the World Health Organization issued a global health alert for SARS, as it became clear the disease was travelling by global air travel. On the 16th of April, the WHO issued a press release stating that the coronavirus had finally been identified by a number of laboratories and was deemed the official cause of SARS, with the virus being named the SARS virus. On the 17th of April, the first confirmed case of SARS from India was reported, and on the 19th, the Premier of the People's Republic of China, Wen Jiabao, announced that there would be severe consequences for local officials who did not report SARS cases in a timely and accurate manner, signalling a major change of policy from their previous attempts to cover it up. SARS had been gaining prominence in the mainland Chinese media, and by late April it had jumped from virtual invisibility onto the front page, with daily reports from all provinces on new cases and measures. In Vietnam, the outbreak was declared over as of the 28th of April, but on the 29th of April, leaders of member countries of ASEAN and the PRC Premier held an emergency summit in Bangkok, Thailand to address the outbreak. Among the decisions made then were the setting up of a ministerial-level task force and uniform pre-departure health screening in airports. On the 3rd of May, the 2003 FIFA Women's World Cup was abruptly moved to the United States due to the outbreak, and on the 31st of May, Singapore was removed from the WHO's list of affected areas. On the 23rd of June, Hong Kong was removed from the WHO's list of affected areas, but Toronto, Beijing and Taiwan remained. On the 27th of June, the World Health Organization stated that the population of the world should be SARS-free within the next 2 to 3 weeks, but warned that the disease could affect China next winter again. By July 2nd, Canada was also removed from the WHO list of affected areas, followed by, on the 5th of July, the removal of Taiwan from the list. With that, the WHO declared that the SARS outbreak was contained. Taiwan's removal from the list signified the end of the pandemic. However, sporadic cases continued to be reported in Taiwan, China, Singapore, and the Philippines until May 2004. In May 2005, the New York Times reported that not a single case of SARS had been reported in the year 2005 or in late 2004, with it being the first winter without a case since the initial outbreak in 2002. In addition, the epidemic strain of SARS that caused at least 774 deaths worldwide by June 2003 has not been seen outside of a laboratory since then. The major part of the outbreak lasted 8 months in all, and while overall deaths were relatively low, the outbreaks led to widespread international policy change from governments, the WHO, and airlines, which were deemed to be a primary cause of the widespread of infections. Nowadays, this outbreak seems an important precursor to the current pandemic, with many similarities to be noted from disease type, origin, and spread. It has also led to a lot of governments changing the way they tackle these health crises, and while some would say it prepared us more for the current COVID-19 pandemic, others would argue that the scale of the current pandemic is due to governments becoming complacent with their strategies that were in place from a previous pandemic.
So that's it for this week's episode of Medisodes. Hopefully you've gained a good insight into the different pandemics that have happened through history and how different health measures were implemented throughout those different periods. So don't forget to like and subscribe to Medisodes for new episodes every week. Thank you.